days following the ICC indictments, Israeli bombs pounded Lebanese targets, which continued after the ceasefire was announced and until it went into effect, even as refugees were returning to their homes in the south. It was as if the Israeli military was mocking the court, which Benjamin Netanyahu had already targeted.
זהו צעד אנטישמי שיש לו מטרה אחת, להרתיע אותנו.
News outlets echoed the allegations of anti-Semitism, called for sanctions against the ICC, and bombarded their audiences with that angle.
זה אירוע כן אנטישמי חמור.
The court finds itself in good company. That same line has been leveled at human rights organizations, aid workers, journalists, the UN, just about anyone who dares to call out Israeli war crimes.
גופים שבמידה רבה מוטים על ידי הטיות אנטישמיות אפילו כנגד ישראל.
Anti-Semitism serves us perfectly because it's a very clear line, and you're either for us or against us. And if you're against us, you're an anti-Semite. It's just that simple. The longer this lasts, the longer we insist that the genocide we are carrying out in Gaza is not just necessary, but appropriate. The more simple we become, the less sophisticated we become. And the less sophisticated we become, the more immediate and self-serving is the trope of anti-Semitism.
For many Israelis, the fear of anti-Semitism and mixing that with any critique of institution is very ingrained, very deeply held. And then the other argument is, what about China? What about Russia? Why are they only going after us? Maybe because we're probably the only country that's committing genocide in broad daylight. More than 44,000 people killed in just over a year. That could be one reason why we are specifically being targeted.
This has a sort of long history in Zionism. It goes back to the Holocaust, the idea that the nations of the world did not help the Jews in their hour of need, and therefore we cannot trust them. So if they help us, they're good. But if they don't, or they criticize us, then we have to remind them of what happened during the Holocaust.
What happens when the criticism comes from within? When the editor of the Haaretz newspaper, virtually the last moderate mainstream outlet left standing in Israel, describes Prime Minister Netanyahu this way.
He doesn't care about imposing a cruel apartheid regime on the Palestinian population while fighting the Palestinian freedom fighter that Israel calls terrorists.
Citing that speech and Haaretz's sometimes critical coverage of the war, the Israeli government cut ties with the paper, announcing it will no longer place ads in Haaretz, denying it a vital source of revenue. The paper reacted by likening Netanyahu to other leaders notorious for limiting freedom of the press in their countries. Having banned Al Jazeera from reporting from Israel 7 months ago, the Israeli authorities are now tightening their grip on the internal news narrative.
There had been conscious attempt from the government for a while to shut down Haaretz. So they were just looking for something like this to happen, and then Shokin said this, and then it just exploded. But Haaretz has been probably the only newspaper that brings testimonies from Gaza, that has reporters that actually talk about what's happening in Gaza and also in the West Bank.
This isn't a boycott in terms of giving interviews or access to government offices. That's not on the table. And the Israeli government doesn't talk to Haaretz that much anyway, even though I assure you, Haaretz is the first paper Netanyahu reads every morning. This is an attempt to go after Haaretz's finances. The government pays for all of these ads. And it's right out of the textbook for how to emerge as a fascist dictatorship 101.
Israel has long been a fascist state, at least towards Palestinians. It's now turning its fascism inwards towards those who actually consume Haaretz. It began with Al Jazeera because something like 75% of Palestinians consume Al Jazeera as their primary source of news. And it's been extended onto Haaretz is because they don't want to have any critique of Israel's carrying out these war crimes and genocide in Gaza, as well as war crimes in Lebanon.
Journalists in Israel constantly work under military censorship. To circumvent that, some reporters or sources will take sensitive information feed it to news outlets outside the country, thus allowing Israeli journalists to report on it by attributing it to those organizations overseas. Last week, on the day the ICC indictment came down, news broke that one of Benjamin Netanyahu's aides had been indicted by an Israeli court for allegedly leaking a classified document to build Germany's biggest selling paper.
בחקירה עולה שפלדשטיין החליט להפיץ את המסמך הביטחוני המסווג לכלי תקשורת בישראל.
The resulting story, which surfaced in September, suggested Netanyahu wasn't the one preventing a deal to free the captives held by Hamas. Hamas's leadership was. Consider the timing. That story went out just after 6 Israeli captives had been found dead, and Netanyahu was feeling the heat.
בהמשך המהדורה נטלי נביא גם את אותו מסמך שפורסם בגרמניה היום.
The suspicion, widely held, is that the story came out of what Israelis now call the poison machine. The operatives working under Netanyahu, in the shadows, misinforming Israelis, distracting them, and swinging news narratives in the Prime Minister's favor.
Now, everybody knows about the poison machine in Israel. The circle of advisors who surround Netanyahu and who provide the media with all kinds of half-truths meant to undermine any news outlet, put something against him, but it's not a secret, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. And the extraordinary thing is that a leader of a state that was humiliated on October 7th, which was very much triggered by Netanyahu's own policies, his position has improved rather than deteriorated.
The very fact that Israeli media is talking about this, people are critical of Netanyahu about this, serves Netanyahu as well. Netanyahu wants this stuff to be front and center, because the more the Israeli public is talking about these details, the less the Israeli public is talking about the state of war, talking about the implosion of Israel as a result of this war. This is Netanyahu's method. He likes to have people obsessed about very, very minor details, because that keeps them confused and too occupied to see the broader picture.
Then there are the Israelis who don't want to see the broader picture. It's a tech-savvy population, and regardless of the misinformation, sycophancy, and spin they're getting from their own news outlets, the truth is out there about the war crimes being committed in their name, if they're interested.
Israelis can get the same media that you and I and others are consuming. They can watch social media, they can see other outlets, some can see Al Jazeera. They choose not to. Israelis prefer to keep their heads in the sand, denying the fact that they are carrying out a genocide. And just imagine how it's going to reflect in the future on not only the country, but the people who allowed this genocide to continue and didn't even bother questioning it when this is the only genocide that we know has been live streamed.
Pakistan is experiencing.
It's crazy, that war. So sick and tired of keep seeing this war, all these main bodies and destruction of the buildings, and totally understand the initial attack was an awful attack. We just want it to stop now, you know, enough's enough. Enough's enough with this conflict. And now Pakistan started now.
Initially imposed an internet blackout. What was different this time was that once the blackout was lifted, people in the city reported being unable to share photos or videos via WhatsApp. A report by Al Jazeera this week offered a clue as to why. According to sources at the Ministry of Defense and 2 internet service providers, Pakistan has deployed Chinese technology to create a so-called national internet firewall. Unlike blunt methods like internet blackouts, this new tool is designed to give the authorities greater control over what they can restrict, right down to specific features of applications. It's all part of a wider crackdown on freedom of speech since Imran Khan's removal from power in 2022 ignited widespread unrest. The social media platform X has been banned since protests back in February. Khan has been in prison for more than a year and faces more than 100 criminal charges, all of which he denies. Polls indicate he remains the country's most popular politician. His party, the PTI, has put the demonstrations on pause. With mainstream media in Pakistan already heavily censored, the new firewall is one more barrier standing in the way of the PTI side of the story.
Thanks, Ryan. Next door to Pakistan, in Bangladesh, it's been 3 months now since a student uprising swept the country's authoritarian Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina from power. During her 15-year rule, Hasina and her party, the Awami League, criminalized political dissent, curtailed press freedom, censored news outlets, jailed journalists, or forced them into exile. With Hasina's departure, many news organizations that had persistently toed the line under her administration have started speaking truth to power. The interim government now in charge says it supports this rejuvenation of Bangladeshi journalism, that it actually welcomes criticism.
When in Rome.
However, challenges remain, from media owners eager to curry favor with the powerful to the lack of legal measures safeguarding media freedom. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on the newly opened media space in Bangladesh and the prospect of lasting change.
When protests broke out in the capital of Bangladesh, Dhaka, in June this year, few could have predicted that within weeks, cities across the country would be in revolt, and that by early August, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, the woman who had governed for more than 20 years, would have fled.
প্রধানমন্ত্রীর পদ থেকে পদত্যাগ করে বিদেশে চলে গেছেন শেখ হাসিনা। আবারও বলছি, ছাত্র জনতার নজিরবিহীন আন্দোলনে শেখ হাসিনা পদত্যাগ করে দেশ ছেড়েছেন।
It was a rapid and seismic political upheaval. Overnight, the country's media did a 180-degree flip.
I remember on August 4, they were completely talking against the student movements, and they were saying that instead of students, the terrorists from political parties were leading the revolution. I mean, they were completely vilifying the student revolution.
সময় পরিক্রমায় শিবিরের ব্রেনচাইল্ড এই আন্দোলন এখন সর্বজনীন কোটা সংস্কার আন্দোলন হলেও তাতে এখনো কলকাঠি নাড়ছে ছাত্র শিবির।
And on August 5th, I have seen a reporter saying that fascist Hasina has fled.
দর্শক, সকাল থেকেই কিন্তু শাহবাগ এলাকায় জড়ো হওয়ার চেষ্টা করছেন ছাত্রছাত্রীরা এবং নানা শ্রেণী পেশার মানুষ।
The Prime Minister fled from Bangladesh and went to India.
With the previous regime, to the point where they almost became the de facto mouthpieces of the Awami League government. After Sheikh Hasina fell on August 5th, and you opened the newspapers and every single front page called her fascist, called her dictator, called her regime authoritarian. You know, newspapers that we just didn't even think had that term in their vocabulary when it came to referring to her. It showed what a free...
Not just Trump then.
Do. In Sheikh Hasina's wake, Bangladeshi media outlets have flexed journalistic muscles that many thought had completely atrophied in the more than 2 decades of her government. There have been investigative pieces revealing what went down in the very last days that Sheikh Hasina was in the country. The orders she gave and the eventual pushback that came from an army that knew she had to flee or risk being killed. Such intimate reporting of the former Prime Minister had long been one of the most stringent editorial red lines in the country. Journalists have also, unlike during the Hasina years, delved into the extent of government corruption.
রূপপুর পারমাণবিক বিদ্যুৎ কেন্দ্র থেকে $500 কোটি বেশি আত্মসাৎ করেছেন সাবেক প্রধানমন্ত্রী শেখ হাসিনা।
Fraud and cronyism in the corporate world is also more sharply in the spotlight. For example, conglomerates closely allied to the Hasina government, like the S. Alam Group.
This is a huge story. S. Alam Group became so powerful, and it's one of the closest ally of the then Prime Minister. It started using state security apparatus for hostile takeover of different organizations, including media. It took over Ekushe Television, which aired one of the speeches given by the opposition BNP leader who is in exile in London. Similarly, he took over 8 banks. Now reports are coming out that he took away almost $20 billion from these banks, and most of his money, actually, investment now is in abroad, not in Bangladesh.
I was one of the authors of one of the stories that you're talking about, and I want to tell you that
That's a traitor move, that.
it was really like a run-of-the-mill regular business story that any publication should be doing. But over here, this involved so much secrecy. It involved multiple layers of legal vetting. I honestly just think we did our duty.
The newspaper Zaima Islam works for is rare in Bangladesh. The Daily Star is a publication that pushed against media repression even during the Hasina years. The journalism the paper produced was matched by the work of just one other outlet, Prathomalo. The two newspapers were the mainstream media holdouts during the many years in which Sheikh Hasina and her party, the Awami League, bent and then broke the media in the country. Media outlets that could not be co-opted were bought out by cronies. Systematic intimidation pushed journalists deeper and deeper under a pile of stories that were deemed taboo. They got calls from officials. Even the most meekly challenging journalists would be blacklisted from the Prime Minister's highly choreographed press conferences. Many journalists left the mainstream and moved online, and yet even they were amongst those kidnapped and disappeared by thugs paid off by the government. Those who were spared were ensnared by harsh media laws.
One usual tactic was to sort of deploy supporters to sue journalists and editors.
Increasing of this anti-immigrants propaganda and hates, and also the bigotry increase a lot.
She's in Toronto, saying the situation in Canada's getting worse.
Concern is like government painting the immigrant to be the cause of the problem, but we are not the cause of the problem. We are the solution of the problem. If the government invests more in economy, the immigrant will be the asset for this country.
That's true. They do work hard. Have hunger. Hunger to give it a go. I think a lot of people in the UK run out of energy.
The Canadian public has been bombarded by narratives that there are just too many people in the country and too many people coming into the country for the number of houses that we have and for the capacity of our healthcare system. And that slow drumbeat has, finally hit home with the public.
Yeah, you gotta have some control. I think everybody can admit that. Then again, I might be hoping for too much. So it looks like a Bangladesh diaspora in Canada there.